it was those clients that had such great difficulty in in their ability to regulate themselves that, were going from therapist to therapist or came to me after seeing many other therapists. And I felt like I have to learn something new to help them so that they can learn how to self-regulate.
The Neurofeed podcast. How is clinical neurofeedback transforming lives? We talk with therapists, researchers, and home users from the intersection of neuroscience and therapy. These interviews tell stories of discovery, empowerment, and learning to thrive. Our guests today are Mary Zaudtke and Chris Wheeler-Doe. Mary is a psychologist who has focused her practice on working with clients who have experienced developmental trauma. The nature of the work is relational, utilizing the tools of EMDR, ego state therapy, and neurofeedback. Currently, her work is helping therapists to grow their skills in both the ego state therapy and neurofeedback. Chris works with individuals and couples who have experienced developmental trauma and/or complex PTSD, including people in recovery from codependency and substance abuse, using neurofeedback, EMDR, and psychotherapy, trauma-sensitive yoga, mindfulness practices, mind-body awareness, spirituality, faith, and the 12 steps. What if we start off with the question, if you have a client who has not done neurofeedback before, how do you describe that to them?
Chris, you want to get started?
Yeah. So if I have a client or a potential client calling to inquire about what exactly neurofeedback is, I use a lot of analogies with my clients, and I talk about, training their brain. You can use the analogy of having a personal trainer going to the gym. And with neurofeedback, we use sensors. And the sensors, I kind of say, imagine they're like a little stethoscopes. They're not putting anything into your brain, but they're just picking up the electrical activity that is going on in your brain, just like a stethoscope would pick up your heartbeat. So, because, oftentimes people will have a little bit of anxiety or a lot of anxiety, thinking that with neurofeedback, we're putting something into their brain or putting an electrical charge into their brain. So I like to squash that myth as soon as possible. So the sensors, when placed on this, picking up the electrical activities, and we're going to train up various parts of the brain. Just like if they were going to the gym with a personal trainer, they might be working on training these parts of their body, or going to work on training various parts of their brain. And
Chris, can I stop you for a second?
Yeah, I can't hear her.
It sounds like your microphone is doing something.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, much better.
Now it's much better. It was kind of going in and out. I was just going to say, is that just me or everybody?
I'll hold it, because that should be better if I hold it.
Do you want
want me to start over?
That would be great. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. So when I have somebody inquiring about neurofeedback, or I'm trying to explain what neurofeedback is to them, I often use the analogy of it's training your brain, not so dissimilar as if you had a personal trainer at the gym and you were trying to strengthen various parts of your body. With neurofeedback, we're putting sensors on the brain, and I say the sensors, imagine they're like little stethoscopes, in the sense that they're just picking up the electrical activity going on in your brain. They're not putting anything into your brain, which is a common worry that people have, is that with the neurofeedback, we're actually putting things into their brain. So I want to dispel that myth as soon as possible. We're just picking up the electrical activity, and then we are trying to train it. And so when the sensors are placed on the scalp, depending on where we place them, with neurofeedback, we place the sensors on the scalp, and depending on where we place them, I tell the clients there are various different parts of the brain that we're training. And similar to the personal trainer at the gym, you might spend some time working on your abs or your glutes. And so with neurofeedback, we spend time working on trying to strengthen the parts of the brain that have been underactive, or quieting the parts of the brain that have been overactive. And so, and I use the analogy to, kind of a goal for everyone is, how do we have a stronger but more flexible brain?
I always find it hard because, I say different things to different people, depending on their situation. But I think the training one is a great one. The body personal trainer and analogy that she uses. But I just let people know that the brain is working at different speeds based on what kind of thing they want to do. So like when they're trying to sleep, the delta is bigger and predominant, and there's still all the other waves, but we want delta to be working. Not when you're awake so much. We don't want so much delta when you're awake, because that'll, it'll make it hard to focus. Theta is a very creative brainwave, and I just love, that brainwave. But it's also the one that can get in the way when you're trying to pay attention, because it's just a step up from delta. And then if you go the next gear up, you're in alpha, which a lot of people try to get into alpha when they want to meditate, which is kind of giving some attention inside as well as outside, both. It's kind of a both and. And then the next step up is SMR, if you're in the central strip, or beta in general. Low to mid beta is actually a really great one for presence and wanting to be really present with what you're trying to learn, which is, it's important when you're learning, but also when you're interacting with your clients. So one of the things that's really important to remember is you should train your own brain too, right? As a clinician, because it helps you be present. And it's also hard to do therapy with a client who can't be present because they're somewhere else. They're like in their trauma, or they're, being hypervigilant. So they can't really be with you in a relationship. And we all know that as clinicians, the relationship is of primary importance, right? And high beta can a lot of times cause, which is the smallest, teeniest wave, can often cause anxiety. It's associated oftentimes with muscle tension. And so it's one of those that we are oftentimes inhibiting. So when we're doing training, we're like saying, make more of this one and make less of this one. And then we'll give you some feedback on that so that you can kind of know if it's, if it's working, and the brain can try it out. And, we have some general ideas about how this, what frequencies work for different people, and every brain is unique. So the way that we work with that is to really have a conversation with this person's brain, right? Like, and when they come back, and it's so important, I always really stress, it's really important that you pay attention to these things, how you're sleeping. Is that changed at all, right? And so how are you thinking during the day? Are you able to pay attention, or do you kind of can't quite get up there, or your brain is going 100 miles an hour and you can't pay attention because of that. Your emotional state. The hard part about the emotional state and a lot of the other things is they're not so biologically in there. Like, so other things can affect it. Like if you had a fight with someone, or, if you're worried about something. And so sometimes you have to really kind of include, well, what is it that's going on in your life right now, as well as, these things. And then what kind of energy do you have? So I'm going to ask them to really keep track of those things. And then another physiological things that as therapists we don't usually ask about is how are your bowel movements, right? Like it's not something we usually talk about, but it can be, a signal about if there's constipation, if there's diarrhea. It can tell you some things about the level of arousal that the client is experiencing. And you're always going deeper into what is their experience, like when does that happen, so that you have a better idea about what that symptom can mean. And then, of course, their own goals. You want to have a baseline, very similar to any other therapy. You want to have a baseline of what their behavior or their experience of life has been, so that you can have some goals of where to move toward. And then you ask about that. And so those are some things that, that I talk about. Chris, do you want to add some more?
You're muted right now, Chris.
Very thorough. Was that, sorry, because I logged on and logged off, I missed the question. Was it the same question that we were addressing before?
Yeah.
I
have a follow-up question if you don't feel like you have anything you want to add.
I don't know that I have anything specifically to add to that.
She did a beautiful job.
I know.
Hard to add.
I know.
Well, I was going to ask both of you, now that, Chris, you're back, what the obstacles or hurdles? Because I always find it's nice to hear the good stuff and how it works and all of that, but where do you find the obstacles, either in people getting started or, kind of along this early process that you're talking about?
I think, some of the obstacles that I face with my clients is, one, the cost.
Yeah. Totally.
Fortunately, we live in a state where some insurances do cover neurofeedback, which is great, but not all. And so for the people that their insurance doesn't cover it, it's, a financial barrier.
Yep.
And then, ideally with neurofeedback, if somebody can come in, a minimum of twice a week, that's great. But logistically, that's very difficult for the majority of my clients. People have work schedules. I have a work schedule. Oftentimes people are wanting hours, or, they're wanting after work hours. And so logistically, there's just those challenges to creating what I would say is an optimal setup for success. With that, I still do see people once a week because I have seen a benefit for clients coming in once a week. And logistically, that it's just not feasible for them to come more often. I think, in areas where, or at times when insurance doesn't cover it, the financial piece is a huge barrier for a lot of people. And I try to be really mindful about that. And try to address, how can we help them to get the service that they need at the time when they need it.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's probably the biggest barriers. And I don't want to say finances, I want to say insurance. Insurance is the biggest obstacle. Their unwillingness for a lot of insurances to understand the importance of this and the research support behind it. I think it's really insurance that's blocking people.
The thing that I'm really grateful about is in Minnesota, the Medicaid pays for it.
That's awesome.
A huge deal, right? So that brings the equity to our state. So I'm very appreciative of that we had some leadership at the time that made some policies because they looked at the data.
The research is great.
Yeah.
It's really bad.
I don't have as many obstacles because when they come to me, they know that that's how I work. I mean, I don't do work without it. It was more during the transition time when I, was just learning it, and I already had like long-term clients, and most of them were kind of like interested in it because I was so excited about it, and they wanted to help me. Help clients want to help you, and that was delightful, right? There were a couple clients who didn't want to do it for their own reasons, and you have to respect that, right? Everybody is in a place where they are, and so that then that's that. But eventually, my practice transitioned into only neurofeedback. I mean, I'm not saying only. I'm saying neurofeedback was a part of the picture.
Right.
It can be used in conjunction with many kinds of things. I use EMDR, sensory motor therapy, ego state work, and I have found that combination with neurofeedback is very helpful. And I think of neurofeedback as the way to help people become more present in the experience, in the relationship, so these other things will work, better. Because, it can be, how do you get some of our most difficult, the clients who had the most difficult history to be in relationship? That's a big deal. And how do you help them be present? So, neurofeedback has been helpful in that way. And particularly, if you start working in processing some of the past trauma, they have to be present to do that. EMDR always says you have to have a foot in the present to be able to process it. Otherwise, you're shutting down or you're getting overwhelmed. And neither of those are, and one of them can be more traumatic, right? And the other one is not helpful because you can't access the emotional content of that memory. So that's how I kind of integrate them, and it was most helpful to me. But in terms of obstacles, once, I think the excitement and the possibility, a lot of people are looking for something. They're like, someone help me. I cannot do, I've
done talk therapy for 20 years. Nothing's helped.
Yeah.
I want to try something different.
And I think that's the draw for me as a therapist. I'm always looking for something that can be more helpful to my clients. And so when I heard about, 𝘲𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 using it and finding it helpful, I'm like, okay, tell me more. So I read 𝘁𝗲𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 book, which is awesome. And, that's my spiel, working with people who had developmental trauma, which, what we know as we study the brain is that kind of, either neglect or trauma causes, the brain is trying to be a great brain for the situation. And so it's just allowing those connections that the client needs at the time. So the little kid who's always is needing to be hypervigilant so they don't get harmed, or is needing to disconnect in order to feel, to survive any kind of safety issues, or if not, if the mother is not responding or father is not the caregiver is not responding, then, you tend to shut down because you can't maintain that level of arousal for too long. It's just too difficult. So, if you see those, YouTube that does, the mother and daughter connection, and they're playing and they're all, and then she goes blank and you can see the child is just getting upset.
Experiment. Yep.
Yeah. And then she stops because she's not able to reach her mother with all the crying. And that's kind of, I think, an experience of disconnection, right? And so we learn these things, and whatever our brain needs to do to help us regulate when we're children, those kinds of networks get strengthened. And some of the ones that we aren't using get pruned, right? We learn that happens in the brain, that some of the other connections get pruned. And so then now we have an adult who has less resources because that brain was created for that initial experience or that growing up experience. And now this brain doesn't have the same neural networks that maybe someone who hadn't experienced those things.
I thought it was fascinating. I know both of you were there for the presentation when I think it was Ruth who was talking about how neglect, that the still-faced experiment is neglect, if prolonged, for not just 5 minutes, how the newer research is indicating it might be in a left amygdala problem versus abuse tending to be a right amygdala. And I think for those who are listening who are experienced providers, it gives us reason to work on the left side, some of the left side treatment trauma protocols that you might not have thought of, because we might have to get to the left amygdala. The piece of that is that we don't think the left and right amygdala are homologous sites. So if you work on one, you don't address the other. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. It just really changed the way I think about neurobiology for my neglected, not that kind of physical sexual abuse, but neglect. So I'm with you, Mary. It really makes a difference.
It's so exciting. It's so exciting that we're at a time that we're exploring this, right? And I just will say, it's one of the most exciting things that I ever did was to start to learn about the brain and the neurofeedback. But,
hardest things too, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And I think the important piece is to realize that, we only know this much, right? There's just so much more to know, and we'll never know it all because we're limited by our brain, even though there's, the brain is doing all kinds of amazing things. But we know enough, right? We know enough to help the brain help itself, which is great.
Yeah. I think coming back to your question about barriers, Leanne, one of the things that I thought about just as Mary was talking right now is, your question, I think, may have been about barriers with our clients, but there's also the issue about barriers to clinicians becoming neurofeedback providers.
Absolutely.
And, for me, becoming a neurofeedback provider has been exciting because it is such a growing field, but also the biggest learning curve of, I would say, my professional career. Really challenging myself to get a better understanding of the neurophysiology, trying to grasp an understanding of all these brain waves and what's going on. And
and technology.
Technology, yes, technology. As I'm, not a digital native, I'm a digital immigrant, as they say, and so learning.
I just learned that term, and I was like, oh, I guess that's how you know I'm a digital native, because I didn't know what that was.
Right. And so, and that hurdle will, I think, definitely decrease as younger people coming into the field, and they're going to have more of a digital. They're going to be digital natives, and working with computers in this kind of complex of a way will be more comfortable for them. But, the endeavor to decide to do it, I learned about neurofeedback in 2012, and it wasn't until 2015 when I did the training, because, there were the challenges of, first of all, there's a lot of different trainings. How do you decide which training is the best for you? And I think that's different for different people, depending on what your client base is and what your practice is about. And then, actually going and doing the training, the cost of doing that. And I know when I was thinking of doing this, I said to my partner, I said, I'm really interested in neurofeedback and I want to get trained to do this. And then there's going to be an investment in not just the training, but buying equipment and then ongoing mentoring. And so this is not a short-term thing. And I was at the place of my professional career, my practice, that I already had a full practice. So it wasn't like I was hoping to learn something new to like fill in the gaps in my practice. I already had a full practice. So there was a part of me that was questioning as a business person, like, is this a good business decision for me? But also just who I am somebody that always wants to be learning and doing new things. And so I thought, I'm going to take the plunge. And I mean, it was a plunge. And like I mentioned, has been the biggest learning curve of my career, but I would say also the most gratifying. And
Agreed.
I would say that it took me less than 2 years to feel like I made my money back from my initial investment of my equipment and my training. And
probably for the outcomes your clients got.
And that is the biggest thing, is the outcomes that my clients got, because the reason that I was interested in it in the first place was, working with people with developmental trauma can be challenging. And there were some clients that I felt like, am I really helping these people? But yet they came to me after seeing many other therapists. So it wasn't like I was their first therapist along the way. They were sent to me because other people didn't feel like they could help them. And I also had the sense of like, I feel like I'm going to be working with this person for, 10, 20 years. And that's not necessarily what I got into therapy, is to work with somebody for that long. Not saying that there might not be times when a client needs that, but there has to be something to help them quicker. And I'm not saying it's quick with neurofeedback, but I'm saying it is quicker. And what I really saw, and as Mary mentioned this earlier, that neurofeedback is probably the biggest tool to help my clients learn how to self-regulate. And once they were able to be more regulated, to be more emotionally regulated, then they had a greater capacity to address the trauma material.
Everything follows from regulation.
Right.
Keep that foundation. We can only provide support. Most of the other work is on the back burner. You spend every session just regulating.
Exactly. And, it was those clients that had such great difficulty in their ability to regulate themselves that, were going from therapist to therapist, or came to me after seeing many other therapists. And I felt like I have to learn something new to help them so that they can learn how to self-regulate. And for me, that's the biggest piece of what neurofeedback has done for me and my clients, is just helping to develop that foundation of self-regulation that they didn't get in infancy, toddlerhood, early childhood. And then once they have that, there's so much more that they're able to do. And the lack of regulation for an adult creates a lot of negative consequences in their life. So not only did they have their childhood trauma to work through, but then their inability to regulate was causing a lot of negative consequences in their present day life, which then only exacerbated everything else. And just the ability of being able to self-regulate and creating more positive outcomes in their present day life gave them, I think the strength and the agency to really start to address all of those underlying childhood traumas.
I 100% agree. It really, my joke, but it's serious, is I'm not interested in doing therapy with my hands tied behind my back, and doing therapy without neurofeedback feels that way. The other piece that I always say is that this funny thing happened when I added neurofeedback. I had to get more clients because my clients would do better, and then they go on and leave and live their lives. I'm working myself out of a job, which is
right.
Not the world's best business strategy, but therapists are not known for that piece. But it's the ethical right thing to do, is to actually work to put ourselves out of business, that they don't need us anymore, rather than needing us all the time. And so I have to get more clients now, which is not a problem, because they actually can go off and live their lives.
Yeah. Yeah. I have no difficulty getting new clients. I've had a wait list, and sometimes, that wait list has gotten way too long. One of the things I have to figure out is how to manage that better. But, people do get better quicker. Doesn't mean it happens, in a few months, but it does take a lot less time than previously.
I wonder if y'all could talk a little bit about why, some of this, the neuroscience isn't quite there yet in terms of research, but I wonder if you could help folks to understand, why is it that neurofeedback, the sort of self-regulation process, seeing your brain seeing its own reflection in the mirror of the EEG, why does that help the therapeutic process? Why does that help the person to develop the relationship, the therapeutic alliance and whatnot? What do you have a sense of what the answer to that question is? Because I can imagine, at least for me, it's definitely the case. Like, okay, so it sounds legit, but what actually is going on there? So do you have a way of talking about that? When does that question come up, even with clients? Like, why is this changing? Why is the neurofeedback changing my brain and my sense of self-regulation?
Well, that's one. Go ahead, Mary.
I think one of the things that, I have a slide that kind of demonstrates that maybe you can put up. But what it shows is people who've had trauma, how their brain is looking inside an fMRI. And what it shows is just a normal compared to PTSD. There's like much more activation, like in terms of a sense of self, in terms of connecting to the frontal lobe, which is that part that kind of anticipates the future. A lot of times you have a foreshortened future with a lot of depression, and with people who've had trauma, they can only think about the present moment. The occipital lobe is more lit up in a normal, meaning they're taking in new information, right? Rather than just revolving, going to the hippocampus and remembering, or wherever they're stored, remembering the how it's happened before, right? So this difference of, just depending on what you initially learn, but not being able to take in new information makes people just kind of keep doing the same thing because that's what they know, right? And fear, we know, kind of contracts us, right? And so it doesn't allow us to experience new things and integrate that so that we can say, well, this is dangerous, but this is not. And so I think that, you know, this slide kind of demonstrates, because the areas of the brain that are activated in a PTSD client are so small. You know, like you're not using your whole brain,
Right.
to function.
I frequently will show that slide. Well, almost everybody. I will show pictures of those slides, the difference of the brain with PTSD versus the brain without PTSD. And I show them how in the brain with PTSD, how, you know, the only part of the brain that's really activated is here in the back. And, you know, that's getting really stuck in the past. And there's that rigidity there, where when somebody has a more robust default mode network, meaning, you know, there's some activity back here, and then there's activity in the insula, which is, you know, kind of the salient, which is kind of being in the present moment, and then activity here in the front in the prefrontal cortex, being able to think about the future. And having a more robust default mode network means that you can move between those spots, and that helps with the regulation. When you're stuck in the past, that's when people are more likely to get reactive to, you know, things that happen in the present moment. And if they're stuck in the past in their brain, then they're reacting to the event in the present moment as if they were in the past, rather than being in the present moment and recognizing, okay, this thing in front of me is not dangerous. I may not like it, but it's not dangerous. Or, you know, so that ability to develop a more robust default mode network is what I say to my clients. This is one of our overall goals. Like, this is a bigger goal for the clients with the developmental traumas. You know, when we're done with neurofeedback, we're hoping that your brain is going to function a little bit more like the control group, the non-PTSD group, than the image of the people with PTSD.
I think the piece that connects what both of you are saying to neurofeedback, for those who don't know neurofeedback, is neuroplasticity. And I know Mary's got a beautiful slide you might be able to put up about that, but that's the brain's ability to be plastic, meaning to change and to grow no matter your age. Plasticity doesn't stop just because you're 75. It goes until you're gone. And neurofeedback goes for that piece. Neurofeedback wants to access the brain's plasticity simply by giving it feedback. And what we're capitalizing on with all the beautiful neuroscience you've both talked about is the brain's desire to change for its own optimal functioning. We capitalize on the brain being a very good learner. The brain is incredibly good at learning and wanting things to be better for itself. It doesn't naturally want things to be better for the world, but that doesn't matter in this scenario. It wants optimal functioning for itself and will always learn if it thinks it's in its own best interest. So we capitalize on knowing all this about PTSD in the brain, that if we give the brain feedback that it's not functioning optimally, it's going to go, oh, shoot, I'm going to try to function better. And then it tries it. And when it feels better, it repeats it because our brain that's why we love sugar. It feels good, so we keep doing it. Well, neurofeedback, getting the beeps and getting the positive feedback from your clinician, feels good. So we keep doing it. And the brain, you practice and you keep doing it and you keep doing it. And then those changes that need to be made that you guys are talking about, the brain can put it all together. Because it's nice that we know those things, but then we have to ask the brain to look at it and go, hey, you got to do something different. And the reason we're going towards regulation rather than just learning disabilities or something else, which we can work on, is that it's the foundation and it's the best thing we can affect, because the brain will move towards flexibility and stability much faster than it moves towards little specific changes. Global changes are easier to get out of the brain because the brain chooses to do with the feedback we give it. We are not forcing the brain to do anything. It chooses its route. And it does that much faster than it will do anything else. Mary, you looked like you wanted to add to that.
Well, I mean,
Chris has to go.
I gotta go.
All right. Bye, Chris.
Sorry, guys.
So adaptive information processing is kind of one of the things that's really important in the EMDR field. And I think that's speaking to that exactly, right? That the brain wants to do things efficiently. It's always trying to create. I mean, what would work? But it learns really, really fast when you're young. And so then after you do it a lot, then it gets strengthened, and so that needs to be, changed. And so we do know that the synapses are like, there's new synapses growing every time you learn something new. Like right now, as you're listening, if you learned anything new, you have new synapses making connections. And there's some that are taken out when you don't use them or you're not connecting there. So the brain is always changing, and that's so exciting, right? Like that's why we all wanted to be therapists. We want to help people feel better about their lives, function better in their lives, and we hope for change, and not just for the sake of change, but more to have more productive lives. So, yeah.
Yay.
Yay.
Yeah, I never know where these conversations are going to go when we start off, and they always end up somewhere really awesome. So thank you, Mary. And I know Chris had to jump off, but thank you for having such an interesting conversation with us today.
I appreciate you inviting us. Thank you.